Imagine waking up tomorrow and seeing one headline everywhere. A massive ice shelf in Antarctica has finally broken apart. At first, it sounds like the kind of disaster that would send ocean levels rising overnight. You might picture water rushing into coastal cities by the next morning. But that is not what would happen. The ocean would not suddenly jump. Beaches would still look the same. Most people might go about their day without noticing anything had changed. And that is what makes this so easy to misunderstand. The floating ice shelf is not the real danger. It is the break holding the real danger back. Behind it sits Thwaites Glacier, one of the largest and most unstable glaciers on Earth. For years, the eastern ice shelf has been pushing against it, slowing its movement toward the sea. But that shelf is cracking. It is pulling away from the glacier. Its connection to the seafloor is getting weaker, and scientists believe it may be getting close to the point where it can no longer hold together. When that happens, the ice shelf itself will not flood the world. Instead, Thwaites could lose one of the last things slowing it down. Think of it like removing the support from a wall that is already leaning. The wall may not fall that exact second. But from that moment on, there is much less standing in its way. And here is the part that is hard to believe. A huge section of this system may depend on one small point beneath the ocean, one underwater ridge where the ice still catches against the seafloor. That tiny connection is helping restrain a glacier nearly 2 kilometers thick. So, what is really holding Thwaites back right now? Why does so much depend on one hidden point at the bottom of the ocean? And what happens when that final anchor is gone? Before we can understand why scientists are so worried, we need to look at what Thwaites Glacier actually is. It sits in West Antarctica, one of the coldest and most remote places on Earth. Most people will probably never see it in person. But even from thousands of miles away, what happens here could eventually affect coastlines around the world. The first thing that stands out is its size. Thwaites isn't just another glacier. It's the widest glacier on Earth. Its front stretches for about 120 kilometers, roughly the width of Florida or Great Britain. Standing in front of it would feel less like looking at a glacier and more like staring at a frozen landscape that never seems to end. Then, there's its thickness. In some places, the ice is nearly 2 kilometers thick. That's a wall of ice so massive it's hard to picture. It's not a thin sheet floating on the ocean. It's an enormous body of land ice that has taken thousands of years to build. This is why people started calling it the Doomsday Glacier. Now, that nickname doesn't mean the world is about to end tomorrow. It isn't about one sudden disaster. It's about what this glacier represents. Thwaites holds an incredible amount of ice. If it begins moving faster toward the ocean, it doesn't just change one corner of Antarctica. It has the potential to influence sea levels for generations. That's why scientists pay so much attention to it. They know this isn't just another glacier. It's one of the most important pieces in the entire Antarctic ice system. But here's something a lot of people don't realize. As enormous as Thwaites is, it's not simply flowing into the ocean as fast as it can. For years, something has been slowing it down. Not another glacier, not a mountain, a floating shelf of ice sitting right in front of it. And that floating shelf is where this story really begins. So what is actually keeping a glacier this massive from rushing into the ocean? The surprising answer isn't another mountain of ice. It's a floating ice shelf. Right in front of Thwaites sits a huge slab of floating ice, about 350 meters thick. Even though it's already floating on the ocean, it plays one of the most important jobs in the entire system. It acts like a brake. As the glacier slowly pushes forward, the ice shelf pushes back. That resistance doesn't stop the glacier completely, but it slows it down. Without it, the glacier would have a much easier path toward the sea. One way to picture it is to imagine a cork in a bottle. The cork isn't the bottle, and it isn't what's inside. But as long as it's in place, everything behind it stays under control. Pull the cork out, and what was being held back is suddenly free to move. The ice shelf works in a very similar way. Another way to think about it is like a support beam holding up a wall that's already under pressure. The beam isn't carrying the whole building by itself, but it's taking enough of the load to keep everything stable. Remove that support, and the wall becomes much harder to hold together. That's exactly why scientists are paying so much attention to this floating shelf. And here's the part that really surprised me. The shelf itself is only about 350 meters thick. That sounds enormous until you compare it to the glacier behind it. which is nearly 2 kilometers thick in places. The glacier is several times thicker than the shelf that's helping restrain it. When you think about it that way, it almost doesn't seem possible. A thinner layer of floating ice has been helping control one of the largest glaciers on Earth. For years, that balance has held. But it hasn't stayed the same. The shelf is cracking. It's slowly pulling away from the glacier behind it. Every new fracture weakens its ability to push back against the ice. And once that break starts to fail, the question is no longer how strong the glacier is. The real question becomes how much longer that floating shelf can keep doing the job it's been doing for decades. At this point, you might think a glacier this huge must be anchored by something just as massive. It isn't. One of the most surprising parts of this story is that a huge section of the floating ice shelf is being held in place by what is basically a single contact point on the seafloor. Deep beneath the ocean, there's an underwater ridge. The bottom of the ice shelf catches on that ridge, almost like a hook catching the edge of a ledge. That one spot has been helping keep the entire shelf from drifting away. When I first heard that, it almost sounded impossible. A glacier the size of a small country is depending on one hidden anchor beneath the ocean. But scientists didn't come to that conclusion overnight. They spent about 20 years watching this exact area. They combined satellite images, GPS instruments placed directly on the ice, and measurements showing how fast the glacier was moving. Instead of looking at one moment in time, they watched how the ice changed year after year. What they saw wasn't random. The cracks kept growing in the same critical area. That area is called the shear zone. It's where the floating shelf rubs against slower-moving ice and the rocky edges beside it. All that pressure gets concentrated into one narrow band, making it the weakest part of the entire structure. Think about bending a piece of metal over and over in the same place. It doesn't usually break somewhere else. It breaks where the stress keeps building. That's exactly what's happening here. Year after year, the fractures have stretched a little farther, some widened, others linked together. And with every new crack, the shelf's grip on that underwater ridge became a little weaker. The danger isn't simply that the ice is cracking. Ice cracks all the time. What makes scientists uneasy is where these cracks are going. They're spreading through the very section that connects the shelf to its last strong anchor. They're slowly weakening the point that's been holding everything together for decades. That's why researchers aren't focused on the biggest crack. They're focused on the one heading straight toward the place the entire system depends on. This is the point where a lot of people get the story wrong. It's easy to hear that a massive ice shelf could break apart and immediately think, that's it, sea levels are about to shoot up. But that's not how it works. The ice shelf is already floating on the ocean. Just like ice cubes floating in a glass of water, it's already displacing its own weight. If those ice cubes melt, the water level in the glass doesn't suddenly rise. The same basic idea applies here. So even if the eastern ice shelf of Thwaites broke apart tomorrow, the ocean wouldn't instantly climb higher. There wouldn't be a sudden wave swallowing coastlines the next morning. And honestly, that's important to understand. Because if people expect an immediate disaster and it doesn't happen, they might assume the warning was exaggerated. But that's exactly where the real danger gets overlooked. The floating ice shelf was never the threat. It was the break. The glacier behind it is a completely different story. Unlike the shelf, that ice is resting on land. It's not already floating in the ocean. As long as the shelf keeps pushing back, the glacier moves forward slowly. It still flows, but it's held in check. Take away that resistance, and everything changes. The glacier suddenly has much less standing in its way. It can begin sliding toward the ocean faster than before. Not in one dramatic moment, but little by little, year after year. That's what scientists are watching so closely. The breakup of the shelf isn't the finish line, it's the starting point. Think about taking the brakes off a heavy truck parked on a steep hill. The truck doesn't instantly reach the bottom. At first, it barely moves. Then, it picks up speed, and the farther it rolls, the harder it becomes to stop. That's the concern with Thwaites. Once the glacier starts accelerating, the process doesn't simply pause because we want it to. Ice sheets respond slowly. Oceans respond slowly. The changes build over decades, and in some cases, they can continue for centuries. So the biggest mistake is focusing only on the day the ice shelf breaks. That day may look surprisingly ordinary. The real story is what begins afterward. because that's when one of Earth's largest glaciers could lose one of the last forces keeping it under control. So if warm air isn't the main reason this glacier is losing its grip, then what is? The answer is something most of us never think about. It's the ocean beneath the ice. When people picture Antarctica, they usually imagine freezing air, snow, and endless white landscapes. But underneath the surface, the ocean tells a very different story. The water isn't the same from top to bottom. Deep below the cold surface is a layer of relatively warm, salty water. It's not hot by everyday standards, but it's warm enough to slowly melt ice when it reaches the places that matter most. And that's exactly what's happening. Because large parts of West Antarctica sit below sea level, that deeper water can move along the seafloor and travel much farther inland than most people would expect. It slips underneath the floating ice shelf and reaches areas that are almost impossible to see from above. That's where the real damage begins. The warm water doesn't attack the top of the glacier, it attacks the bottom. It melts the underside of the floating shelf. It weakens the point where the ice grips the underwater ridge. It reaches the grounding line, the place where the glacier is still resting on land before it starts to float. Those are the parts holding the entire system together. And they're being worn away from underneath. What makes this even more unsettling is that almost none of it is visible to the human eye. From the surface, the glacier can still look enormous. It can still seem solid and unchanged. But underneath, the foundation may already be weakening little by little. It's a lot like a house with hidden damage below the floor. Everything above ground still looks normal. The walls are standing. The roof is fine. But the support underneath is slowly disappearing. You don't notice the problem until it becomes impossible to ignore. That's why scientists spend so much time studying what's happening beneath the ice instead of just looking at the surface. Because the biggest warning signs aren't always the ones we can see. Sometimes the most important changes are happening in the one place almost nobody gets to look. And in the case of Thwaites, that's exactly where the glacier is becoming most vulnerable. For a long time, scientists knew what was happening on the surface of Antarctica much better than what was hidden underneath it. The ice covered almost everything, so the landscape below stayed a mystery for decades. That started to change when researchers built one of the most detailed maps ever made of the bedrock beneath Antarctica. By combining decades of data from aircraft, satellites, radar surveys, and other measurements, they finally got a much clearer picture of what was hiding under all that ice. And what they found changed the way people looked at Thwaites Glacier. Not all of Antarctica sits on the same kind of ground. Much of East Antarctica rests on bedrock that's above sea level. That makes it harder for ocean water to reach deep beneath the ice. West Antarctica is very different. Large parts of it lie in deep basins below sea level. Instead of acting like a wall, the landscape creates pathways that allow seawater to travel much farther inland beneath the glacier. And Thwaites sits right in one of those vulnerable areas. That hidden shape of the land is one of the biggest reasons scientists are so concerned. Here's why. The place where the glacier stops resting on land and begins floating is called the grounding line. As warm ocean water melts the ice from below, that grounding line slowly retreats farther inland. At first, that might not sound like a big deal, but as it moves back, it reaches deeper parts of the basin. Deeper water allows thicker ice to sit at the front of the glacier. Thicker ice flows faster toward the ocean. As more ice moves away, the grounding line retreats even farther inland, where the water is deeper still. Then the whole cycle repeats. More retreat, thicker ice, faster flow, even more retreat. That's what makes this process so difficult to stop. It doesn't need a new trigger every year. Once the cycle is established, it can keep feeding itself. That's why researchers describe it as a self-reinforcing system instead of a one-time event. What really stands out to me is that none of this is happening because of one dramatic crack or one sudden collapse. It's the shape of the land beneath the glacier that's quietly making everything worse. The surface may look calm, but underneath, the landscape is creating the perfect conditions for the glacier to keep pulling itself farther inland, one step at a time. Up to this point, everything we've talked about has focused on one glacier, but the story doesn't end with Thwaites. One of the biggest reasons scientists pay so much attention to it is because it isn't standing alone. It's connected to a much larger part of West Antarctica, almost like one important piece holding a much bigger system together. I've heard people compare it to removing the keystone from an arch, and I think that image makes a lot of sense. The keystone isn't the biggest stone, but once it's gone, the rest of the structure becomes much less stable. That's the concern with Thwaites. If it retreats far enough, it may no longer help slow the neighboring glaciers that drain into the same part of the ocean. Those glaciers could also begin moving faster, adding even more ice to the sea over time. That's why researchers don't see this as the story of one glacier. They see it as the story of what could happen to an entire region. The numbers help explain why. According to the research discussed in the video, Thwaites Glacier alone holds enough ice to raise global sea levels by about 65 centimeters if it were ever lost completely. That by itself would reshape flood risks for coastlines around the world. But the bigger concern is what happens if the wider West Antarctic ice sheet becomes unstable. That larger ice sheet contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by roughly 3 meters. Those changes wouldn't happen overnight. They would unfold over many decades, or even centuries. But that doesn't make them unimportant. It simply means the choices people make over time become even more important. Researchers say the number of people affected could reach into the hundreds of millions, depending on how quickly sea levels rise and how well countries prepare. Better coastal defenses, smarter planning, and earlier action could make a huge difference in how communities adapt. Places with low-lying coastlines would face some of the biggest challenges. Countries like Bangladesh are often mentioned because so many people live only a few feet above today's sea level. Major cities such as New York, Miami, London, Shanghai, and Tokyo are also part of the conversation. Not because they're guaranteed to disappear, but because they would face increasing pressure as sea levels continue to rise. And I think that's the most important point. This isn't really a story about one glacier sitting at the bottom of the world. It's a story about how something happening thousands of miles away can slowly influence coastlines, cities, and communities almost everywhere else. The glacier may feel incredibly distant. The ocean connecting it to the rest of the world is not. So after looking at everything, I think the biggest takeaway is actually pretty simple. The event scientists are watching most closely isn't the ocean suddenly rising overnight. It's the moment the eastern ice shelf finally breaks away. That floating shelf isn't the disaster itself. It's the barrier that's been helping slow one of the most important glaciers on Earth. Once that barrier is gone, the glacier behind it could begin moving faster toward the ocean. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic collapse. But little by little, year after year. That's what makes this story different from the headlines people usually expect. There probably won't be one day when every coastline suddenly changes. The real impact builds slowly. It unfolds over decades. And once that process gains momentum, it becomes much harder to slow down. So if there's one thing worth paying attention to, it's not a giant wave or a sudden flood. It's the announcement that the eastern ice shelf has finally separated from the main glacier. That could become the moment scientists look back on as the beginning of a much bigger change. Antarctica feels incredibly far away. Most of us will never stand on its ice or see these glaciers with our own eyes. But the oceans connect Antarctica to every coastline on Earth. What happens there doesn't stay there. Over time, it reaches all of us in one way or another. If you enjoy exploring the science behind our planet, the changes shaping our climate, and the discoveries that help us understand Earth's future, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.